were observing that all of the discussion initially was in fact about the pandemic, about the spread of the virus and the number of people that were being impacted, and people were starting to forecast how that could move across the world. And of course, that has implications that there are causal links tied to people not being able to report for work, to people who are not going to be able to produce the things that we're interested in. But when we were first measuring that, we were just seeing it as a number of events that people were recording. So in our data model, we have this idea that there's a category of event and there's a location where people are discussing it. And we saw this emergence of discussion of an epidemic in China. And we saw that emergence move on and talk about South Korea and talk about Japan. And then we saw all of a sudden it was being picked up on this cruise ship. And as soon as that started to occur, we started to see some discussion and some murmurs around how that will actually impact the indicators, the financial aspects of companies. And the cruise ship is a very specific example, but even before that, people were saying, gosh, will Apple, who's really using a lot of supply from China, be able to continue to sell their products if this disease spreads significantly across China? And so we categorize our key performance indicators, our KPIs, in various ways. And one of the schemes we use is, are these tied to the supply of actual products and how they're being produced, or is it tied to the demand for products and how they're being purchased? And so as these things were spreading and we saw this acceleration, it was obvious right away that people were seeing that the price of oil and the price of energy was declining because there's not going to be as much demand in a time when companies are not producing, when people are at home. But there was a later wave when people were saying, gosh, if there's a decrease in the supply, that demand will also be impacted. And so energy is a good example where we didn't hear a lot of people saying there's going to be less oil produced. But on the discretionary front, where people were discussing the cruise ships and hotels, that impact was much more apparent. And so because we saw this kind of discrepancy between supply and demand, we produced these reports to say, look, this is where people are really focused today. This is where they feel the impact, and there's a discrepancy here that's interesting, and maybe it's worth making that information more publicly available, because the implications maybe haven't been completely felt by the market. Of course, this was 3 weeks ago, and things have changed quite a bit since then, and I think across the board, the impact has been felt. But Pierre, my co-founder, and others in the company were interested in making that information public as soon as we found it.
Absolutely. So what are your next steps? What's the plan to proceed? Because I understand you generated a dashboard. Is it a dynamic tool? What's your kind of plans for the future?
So we were lucky in some sense in that we'd been working on the architecture to support creating real-time dashboards for many months. And we had a real-time tool that lets you look at individual companies and individual industries, but we felt like it was really a big technical challenge to be able to ask questions that were fairly complicated about really gigabytes of data, and be able to deliver something that was actually updated on a regular basis. And so with this coronavirus example, we said, look, we need to look at all the data on a regular basis. We need to be able to save that information and update it every hour. And we were able to accomplish that. And so the system is reading in real time about 40,000 articles per day. If the article comes in and it's not in English, we have 18 languages that we can translate into English before we analyze. And what we do is integrate that information and we categorize it. So we understand right away whether this is a text that's talking about 5 companies or talking about an event. How is this relevant? And we basically tag that and put that into an index where we can then efficiently ask questions. So all of that is to say there's a big machine in place behind the scenes that's applying actually hundreds of CPUs simultaneously to read all of this, to put it in a place where we can ask these questions, And then what we do is every hour we update our question set, and we say, of all the news that has occurred in 2020, how many of those talk about the coronavirus? And of those articles, how many actually explain what could be the impact? That's the causal link that is more informative in our minds than just simply saying there was 5,000 articles. Nobody can do anything with that. But saying that of those articles, we found 35 references to somebody saying a company that's based in Germany will have their sales decline, that's actionable. And by putting that in a bar that actually compares that to every other country, you can see where the focus is shifting. You can see where people are observing implications and they're starting to understand, and also where they're starting to forecast, oh gosh, this could be next. The US could be next, Mexico could be next, and they're starting to kind of move their attention, as well as you start to see some fatigue. You know, when the same news comes out over and over again, it's not always talked about on the same scale. So for instance, this week we're actually seeing less chatter in the last 7 days talking about the impact of coronavirus to company KPIs than we saw last week. And some of that is because we're starting to see some relief. We're seeing movements by the Senate and the House to approve bills that will hopefully stabilize the market. And so the panic, I think, may be passing. It's a little too soon to say that for certain, but it's always fascinating to understand that fatigue and the fact that some of these links are obvious, but they're easy to forget. And our system doesn't forget them.